Okay, welcome back. I would like to do a quick demonstration here of how to create a virtual switch. But before we get started, let's just take a look at how would you find a distributed switch using the vSphere client. As you can tell in this screen capture, we are not in the hosts and clusters view. We are not in the VMs and templates view. We're in the networking view. And when you're in the networking view, you have visibility into all the different networks, whether they are with standard virtual switches or if they're in a distributed virtual switch. So as we can see here, there actually is a distributed switch here. By looking at the icons, the globes that you see there with the name VM network, that's a port group on a standard switch. But then the items that look like actual switches, the ones that are labeled DVS Lab and DVS SA Data Center, those are distributed switches. And then as you can see, you can look into their child objects, showing you their actual port groups that are a member of those distributed switches. The thing to note here is that they're going to only be viewed and managed by using the networking view, because what we're seeing here, the virtual switches are child objects to the data center. So let's just show you how easy it is to create one though. I'm going to switch over to our lab. So hang on one second. Okay, we're in our lab environment here, and you'll see here that we have a vSphere environment made up of two different vCenter servers. We've got a vCenter named SAVCA01. We have another vCenter called SBVCA01. So we have SA and SB, right? Because we have our two different sites, Site A and Site B. And then we happen to have some hosts and clusters in each of the different sites. But to build a network virtual switch, you need to be in the networking view. And then in the networking view, you have your standard virtual switches like this one here with the globe. That's a standard virtual switch. And that's actually just the port group, not the switch itself. But with a distributed switch, we actually have the virtual switch here called DVS SA Data Center, and we have some port groups in there. This has been built for us by the lab team. We, of course, are going to build our own distributed switch. You do that by clicking on the data center object and select that you would like to create a new distributed switch. And basically with a distributed switch, unlike a standard switch, you can give it whatever name you like. So I'm going to call mine DVS Lab. Now it's going to ask you what version of a distributed switch you would like to create. Because every update to vSphere, there's been an update to virtual switches, you'll have to choose the version so that in case that you have still a mixed environment, maybe you're running vSphere 7 in your vCenter, but you still have some ESX servers that are still running vSphere 6.5 or 6.7, you have the ability to build a backwards compatible distributed switch. So if everybody's gotten their hosts upgraded to vSphere 7, well, then you go ahead and build a vSphere 7 distributed switch. But to be backwards compatible, we have the version 6.6, which maps to vSphere 6.7, and a distributed switch version 6.5, which maps to vSphere 6.5. And also, by the way, if you hit the little I or info button here, it'll tell you about what features have been added to each of the different versions of vSphere so that you get an idea of where the features actually were introduced. So in any case, we're going to go with our vSphere 7 since we've updated our whole environment to vSphere 7. The next thing the wizard's going to ask you is how many uplink groups are you going to create here? If your distributed switch, which is going to connect to every one of your ESX servers, every one of your ESX servers hopefully has multiple uplinks that are going to connect it to common networks so that you can have all the uplinks on those ESX servers managed centrally by the distributed switch. Now, to make this as simple as possible, you can tell the distributed switch how many uplinks you're planning on managing. Now, you can always change this afterwards. We're going to start off with 4 uplinks. So that just means that we're expecting each host to have 4 actual physical uplinks. Then it'll ask you about network out of control. We'll talk about that later. It's enabled by default. It will create a port group for you. I'm going to call it something else. So just call it SA production. So nice, it creates a port group for us. And then it summarizes everything that we're going to do here. So we're basically telling it to build a switch with the vSphere version, 4 uplinks per host, and we're going to create a port group called PGSA production. So very quickly, it has now added the it's added the distributed switch. Our next step actually is to add hosts to this distributed switch. Now, by the way, if you're following along, you can actually click on the distributed switch, click on its configure tab, and then click on topology to see where we are in the process. And as you can see here, we've got a port group. This is our distributed switch. And then over here, we've actually got 4 uplinks. And we can also see how many actual physical adapters have they been attached to. We have not added hosts just yet, so we don't see any of that just yet. So that's actually our next step. What you'll do next is click on your distributed switch, select add and manage hosts, and specify I would like to add my hosts to my switch. So you tell it you would like to add some hosts. You'll have a list of maybe all 50 of your hosts. I'm going to add not every host, but almost every one of them. I'm going to add hosts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 to my distributed switch. Next, it says, okay, you've got all these hosts ready to go. We now want to add their uplinks. So let's go ahead and do that. So now it happens to tell me, okay, every one of these hosts actually have several uplinks. And if those uplinks are actually in use with other virtual switches, for instance, host number 1 is connected to a standard vSwitch 2. Going through this list, we'll find that host number 2 is also attached to a standard virtual switch named vSwitch 0. And then our hosts 4, 5, and 6 are actually connected to the other distributed switch with other uplinks. But one thing you'll notice is that vMNIC 2 is unused by any one of the hosts in my environment. It doesn't matter if they're on those 3 hosts here or if it's on the hosts that we looked at earlier. vMNIC 2 is available on all those hosts. And I happen to know that's actually cabled up the same way. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add vMNIC 2 from every host to this distributed switch. So you select on vMNIC 2 on the first host, click on Assign Uplink, and now it's going to ask me which uplink group would I like to assign that actual physical uplink with. Well, I'm going to add it to my first uplink group called uplink 1. Now, if I had 50 hosts, doing this operation of assigning an actual adapter to each and every host would be a bit of a painstaking process. So thankfully, there's this checkbox here. Would you like to apply this uplink assignment to the rest of the hosts? So we happen to have these 5 hosts, and I know that on all those hosts, vMNIC 2 is all connected to the same network. This makes that actually pretty easy. I just select that, and it will then take every single host. If I scroll through this list, I'll see that uplink 1 is being assigned to vMNIC 2 on each and every one of my hosts. Very good. Up next, it'll ask me about any VM kernel adapters that I might want to add to this. Well, I actually don't want to add any VM kernel ports. I'm going to leave them where they are, so I'm just going to leave those alone. And it will also ask me about my virtual machines and would I like to migrate individual virtual machines over to this distributed switch. Well, since I did create a port group called production, that's my intention. I find, though, doing this through this interface is not that, well, it's intuitive, it's just not very convenient. I find that if you've got a whole bunch of VMs that are already on another virtual switch and you want to move them here, I actually have to pick in each VM one by one. So I actually prefer to do this in another way. So we'll show you that in a few moments. So that creates the hosts, or it assigns the hosts to my distributed switch. And you'll notice this will change now. You'll see now that we've actually got the host assigned, now it tells me once this updates, let's just make sure it gets updated. All right, looks like everything has completed. And sure enough, here we go. Now it tells me uplink 1 has actually been associated with vMNIC 2 on every single one of my hosts. Very good. So I have my topology ready to view everything. I just need to put some VMs in here. The easiest way to add VMs, I find, is this. Go to where your VMs are currently located. I happen to know that there are VMs that are in this management port group on my other distributed switch. In fact, if I click on virtual machines over here, we'll find there are 2 VMs here. So if I want to move those VMs over, what you can do is right click on this and select migrate VMs to another network. So I'm taking it from this port group, choosing my new port group called production, and it will now migrate whatever VMs I like. So this is nice. If I do have lots of VMs, this is a lot easier to just check the box. Whereas with the other interface, you would have to actually pick and choose each VM. This is far easier. And so now my VMs have been moved over to there. So now let's go back to my distributed switch, go to my configure topology. This becomes your main central point of visibility, I find. Oop, that's the wrong switch. Let's go click on DVS Lab. And here we go, that's better. Now I see my 2 VMs are now on my virtual switch. They're powered off right now. If I power them on, they would have their link lights showing here, as well as these link lights. Even nicer is that I can actually click on one of these VMs and it will actually show me with the nice little gold line indicating which uplink on which host does this VM actually run on, right? This VM is happened to be on the same host. So these lines will indicate the actual virtual connections. So I know this is actually previewing a bit about what you're going to do in the upcoming lab, but just to show you how easy it is to manage this virtual switch. For instance, if I want to manage any port group, you simply click on the port group, select on the configure tab, and you'll find their properties, their policies, and if I ever need to make any changes to these, I can easily just hit the edit button to make those changes. We'll see that in the next part 3 of this lesson. So stay tuned. We'll take a look at making adjustments to all these different port group settings right after the break.